Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to my Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome to the Party Pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 164. I'm talking with Richard Salsman. He's a senior scholar with the Atlas Society. He's a economics professor with Duke, and he's also been doing consulting on his own for a while. So he's a very knowledgeable man. He's very well read on the founding fathers, and he's going to make a case for Alexander Hamilton today, which I'm very much looking forward to. It should be very interesting. As somebody who's read a lot of Jefferson, I do have my biases, so I'm going to get challenged here. How are you, Richard?
Very well. Thanks for having me, Chris. Glad to be here.
First question, Richard. How did you get into Ayn Rand?
When I was about 20, halfway through college, I was bored one summer, and on my father's shelf was Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. Unbelievable. In hardcover.
Yes.
So that was 1979 or so, probably 14 years after the book came out. Chris, when I picked up the book, I thought it was about how factories were run, how factories operated. That's how naive I was. So it was an eye-opener. I think I was raised mostly conservative, but it was an eye-opener to read this book about the ideological case for capitalism. And actually, the chapter that most floored me was the one where she critiques conservatism. I think it's called Conservatism and Obituary. And she was saying this is why conservators aren't very good about defending capitalism. And I had heard those weak arguments, at the dinner table and elsewhere. So realizing that it was a moral as well as an economic system was a real big change for me. So literally from that time onward, 1979 or so, when I was 20, I read everything I could get my hands on of Ayn Rand, mostly starting with the nonfiction, actually, and then turning to the novels. I would attend Dr. Leonard Peikoff's lectures in the 80s and 90s at California, New York, and elsewhere. So I think actively began writing and researching myself and giving lectures in the late 80s. So it took me about a decade to absorb and then apply it to my field, which was money and banking. By this time, I was on Wall Street in finance and began writing about banking and finance and free banking and the gold standard and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that was how I got started, Richard. Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, what hardcover was at my local library.
Oh, that's good. You don't hear that very often. Yeah.
Yeah, So anyway, yeah. So so you've obviously had a pretty long career. So what is your case for Alexander Hamilton? Why you think Alexander Hamilton, as you said, a great American would be Hamiltonian. What's your case there?
Yeah, so just the main work here I'm relying on is after years of work, but published in the Objective Standard of spring 2017. It's called America at Her Best is Hamiltonian. Now, 2017, if you think about it, is 2 years before COVID, but it was written somewhat in response to what was going on in 2015 in Charlottesville with the race riots and the turmoil. Not really, I don't think, due to Trump, but I was long been a student of the founders, and I myself in the 80s and 90s was leaning toward Jefferson as the best of them. And mostly because that was kind of the bias within objectivism. Was also, quite frankly, the statements made by Peikoff and Rand and others, when asked in Q&A, they would usually name those. And then the other thing is you could tell that in the libertarian side of things, they were always painting Hamilton as the statist, as the counterpose to Jefferson. So you got this kind of Dudley Do-Right versus Snidely Whiplash setup. The Dudley Do-Right was Jefferson, and the Snidely Whiplash bad guy was Hamilton. Any bad stuff going on now was attributed to Hamilton. I was always kind of suspicious of that, but as you said offline here earlier, there not that many objectivists really spend a lot of time researching the founders. One good exception is down at Clemson, Brad Thompson has been a long-time objectivist. Now he specializes in atoms, so his particular view is that Adams is the best of the founders. I think the best way to start is the top five, in my view, in terms of importance, would be obviously Washington, but then I would say Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, and Adams. In that last slot, some people might put Franklin. Andy Bernstein, for example, is big on Franklin. Now, here's my conclusion over the years, and this is about 10 or 12 years of intensive study of the founders, especially reading them in the original. First of all, in terms of setting up the United States, Hamilton, unlike every other of those five, was involved in all five pieces of it, which is hard to believe, actually. So if you think of the steps required to establish this country, the Revolution, the Declaration of the Revolution, he was a teenager then at Columbia University, then called King's College. But then he also participated in the Revolutionary War itself as a main aide to Washington. So he was a military guy as well. And then after the war was won, I don't think people realize this, there was no guarantee that there would be a constitutional convention or that the United States federal government would be set up. He was instrumental, most people know, in writing the Federalist Papers and arguing for a constitutional convention to create the Constitution and bring the 13 states together. So I've often said that he put the U in USA. The states were not united until that Constitution was ratified and implemented. And many of the Jeffersonians were against it. They were called anti-federalists. And Hamilton led the Federalists. Again, the argument that there should be a federal level of government to guarantee rights. Okay, there's still two more steps, though. Just because you declared independence, won the war, and established this Constitution, you still had to carry it out and administer it. And that was very new. It wasn't clear to people how this should actually be done. There were no term limits. So, for example, they didn't realize whether, Washington could walk away after 2 term limits and not be a monarchist. He was Treasury Secretary. He was instrumental in fixing the dollar and fixing the debt, which was in default when he got there. So that and many other ways, he and Washington and some others were really instrumental in showing how to administer constitutionally limited government. That was a blank slate when people started. And then the last thing I'd mention is he was very good, him and Washington, on foreign policy. One of the last indelible marks he made, both Washington and he, was that U.S. foreign policy should be very selfish in the sense of we should not be spreading ourselves too thin. We should not be policemen of the world. We should not be imperialistic. He wrote Washington's farewell speech, which warned against entangling alliances with others. And so they were different on that regard as well, because the Democrats, Jeffersonians and others, over the years have got us in all sorts of wars and had this view of, to make the world safe for democracy. So though we can get into the content more, but in terms of importance, you can't name any other of the top 5 that were involved in every one of those crucial steps. Jefferson was involved in the Declaration, but not the war. He wasn't even at the Constitutional Convention. Adams was president and was involved in the convention, but no part of the war. So this is what I mean about you can't find a real more formidable founder who within all these crucial elements of creating the United States. And he was Washington's favorite, which I think helps. I would name Washington as the most important, because if you don't have a general who wins the war, and if you don't have a president who shows how it's done, you don't have anything. But aside from Washington, Hamilton to me is the tops.
Yeah.
But there's content part of this, Chris. What I really laid out there was, can you name Hamilton as among the top 5 as the most relevant and crucial to creating the country and setting it on a good path? It has to be Hamilton. But we could talk about other things like what he thought of the Constitution versus democracy, what he thought of a capitalist economy versus Jefferson's kind of feudal agrarian one. He's accused of being a protectionist on trade and tariffs, which he wasn't. He's accused of being a central banker who wants government to, monopoly print money. That's not true either. So there's a bunch of things like that we can talk about that he's also very good on.
Well, I believe, for example, that under the Articles of Confederation, every state was actually issuing its own money.
Right. Yeah. Yes, that was happening. And the other thing they had was protectionist measures against each other.
So there were actually, so if I
New Jersey.
So if I took my apples from Virginia and sold them in North Carolina, I might have to pay a tariff.
Right. And actually, after the war ended, there was still disarray and in fact increasing animosity among the states. Hamilton and Madison met, I think it was in Maryland, and said, you know what, we should have a convention. This is how they put it. We should have a free trade zone. So their initial motive was not to create a whole new federal government or craft a constitution. It was simply to try to minimize the protectionist barriers between the states. And once they realized, well, we can do that, and that became the Commerce Clause, by the way, that the government should make sure that there's free commerce among the states. But the more they looked at it, the more they realized, wait a minute, if we unify the states on a whole bunch of levels, and not just on that issue of trade between the states, that'd be a good thing. And then here's another way of looking at how he is mispresented. He's mispresented by wanting to have a federal government, which the Articles of Confederation did not have. He's seen as being a big government guy. He's seen as being a oppressive monarchist type, because the Constitutional Convention, Articles of Confederation did not have an executive branch, didn't even have a presidency of having any power. They didn't really have a judiciary. So in a way, the Hamiltonian Federalists are saying, listen, the only kind of government we have is this single branch congressional government. And what we need is three branches, and we need them checking each other. And we need a balance of powers, the kind of standard stuff that today most civics courses teach as the best way to do government, to have them checking each other. And so by the time they were advocating the Constitution, it was that kind of Constitution, not one that was giving government all power, but in a way taking power away from the states, like Virginia, in other words, to do nasty things. And of course, so then the states, the Virginians would say, this is terrible, or we're not going to cede our power to the federal government. And so in a way, the constitutional project was one of diminishing government power by taking it away from the states and putting it into a federal government that was restricted.
And, Richard, I do think maybe part of the reason why Hamilton has suffered is, because you would agree then that Hamilton would be absolutely positively appalled by what America is nowadays.
Well, I think absolutely. I think one way of interpreting this would be, since he and the Federalists, and he wasn't the only one, Washington was this way, since they did advocate a federal government, point one. And point two, since fast forward to today, the federal government is huge, oppressive, nasty, authoritarian, fiscally profligate. The big leap of logic is, well, Hamilton must have wanted all that. If you back into it, there was a real fear at the time, by the way, that 7 or 8 year period between winning the war and convening the convention. It was called the critical period. There were many people who thought this is kind of anarchic between the 13 states. There's no overarching government uniting them all. And many of them feared that the Brits, the Spanish, or the French would come back in and take over by taking advantage of the disarray and the animosity among the states. So, I mean, if you want to rerun history in that regard, you could say that without the Federalists creating the Constitution, we wouldn't have had that first great, 100-year run from 1790 to 1890.
And in some respects, I have to say, I think that might be why the War of 1812 was kind of necessary, is because I don't think Britain really respected us after we were independent, but maybe after the War of 1812 they did.
Right. And it's interesting, that war, because we'd already beaten them, in the first war. So you have to scratch your head and like, well, why would this be revisited? And Hamilton died in 1804, of course, at the hands of Aaron Burr in the duel.
Yes.
So 8 years later, you get the War of 1812, which lasted 2 years or so. But interestingly, it's under the administrations of Jefferson and Madison. It's really under Madison. But Jefferson and Madison came in, and they basically eviscerated the military. I mean, we didn't have, a huge military at the time, but their view was government should be very, very small, and we should eviscerate the military and the Navy. And then the other thing they started doing was putting discriminatory punitive tariffs on Britain. So whereas Hamilton and Washington and those guys, their view was, listen, tariffs are the only source of revenue we have. There's no income tax at the federal level. So they knew that tariffs had to be in place for some funding of government. But their view, very fairly, I thought, was let's have low tariff rates, like 5% or less. And then the key here, Chris, also uniform across the board. In other words, they're the same for all imports. They're the same against all other countries. So you're not what's called discriminating between one country and another. Well, Jefferson and Madison hated Britain. and they love the French. So the minute they got in, they started putting punitive tariffs. It's like Trump putting tariffs on China. Jefferson and Madison came in and started putting punitive tariffs on Britain and favorable tariffs on France. Now, this is the France that's Napoleonic. That's the other odd thing. Jefferson is seen as such a libertarian type, but Hamilton hated the French Revolution. He thought it was awful. He wasn't for monarchy. Obviously, he was willing to overthrow George III's influence, but the idea that it ended in such anarchy and Napoleonic authoritarianism, and Jefferson never criticized any of that. But anyway, that was one of the instigators of the War of 1812. The British were at war with Napoleon, and Jefferson was at war with Britain with this tariff policy. So that's one of the reasons there was a War of 1812. And it's a shame, but it wasn't a Hamiltonian policy. It was a Jeffersonian Madison policy.
Yeah, it was a very one thing also is though where else do you think what else do you think Hamilton got right? Obviously, getting us all on one unified currency, which
a couple things. Let me just start with the politics, then go to the finance, which is very interesting. Quickly on the politics, the basic difference between him and his rivals. And again, the rivals here are always going to be either some form of Jeffersonian, Madisonian. Madison changed, actually, because him and Hamilton were allies during the creating of the Constitution and the writing of the Federalist Papers, but afterwards he allied with Jefferson. Here's the first thing. Hamilton is very big on constitutionally limited government. He's very much interested in rights being protected, even if you're the rich. His view was everyone has rights. And constitutionally limiting government and having a Bill of Rights that says, Congress shall pass no law restricting certain things. The rivals were almost more like pure Democrats. Their view was whatever the majority wants is okay. So Hamilton would often mock this as, you think the voice of the people is the voice of God. It isn't. The people are often wrong. The people are often stupid. The people are often vicious and envious. And government laws should protect private property very scrupulously. Jefferson not only didn't support the U.S. Constitution initially, he jumped on board afterwards, but his view was the constitutions, even if they exist, should be torn up every 20 years. That's how radical Jefferson was. Jefferson's view was no generation should lock in subsequent generations into some parchment. So he wanted a revolution, not a revolution so much, but tear up the Constitution and write a new one every 20 years. The Hamiltonians thought that was just awful. This was not a basis for durable, reliable, predictable government. Another thing about him, which is very interesting, is he's big on the judicial branch doing what's called judicial review. So here was the idea that the judiciary should strike down any laws that Congress passes that violate the Constitution, and it should restrict the executive from violating it as well. If you know, there's a long history of Jeffersonian democratic argument that the judiciary is illegitimate in the sense of it's unelected. These are unelected, robed, jurists who there's a lot of that. You see that even today. They'll say the Supreme Court, is not elected. And the Hamiltonians thought that was awful. But of course, they believed in the idea of objective scrutiny and objective law in a way the other Democrats didn't. Now, here's a huge one, big one, racism and slavery. People, especially critics of the founders, lump them all together and call them slavers. But there was a huge difference between the Hamiltonian Federalists and the Jeffersonians. The Hamiltonians were abolitionists. As early as Alexander Hamilton, he headed a manumission society in New York. He told Washington that he should have black troops to win the war. So the Constitution had a safety, and not a safety valve. They had a 20-year trigger that by 1808, the slave trade had to stop. That was put in by the Federalists, not by the Jeffersonian. So there was this whole difference between Hamilton in the North, from New York, abolitionists, anti-racist, versus the Southern feudalistic, agrarian, Jeffersonian. So Hamilton always was like more capitalist, more manufacturing, more urban oriented. He wasn't against farming. He didn't think it was unproductive. Yeah. But the Jeffersonians had this French philosophy called physiocracy. And if you look it up, physiocracy basically says only farming is productive. and not just productive, they would say noble. So they literally had this view that that one sector was fundamentally productive, and all the other sectors kind of was parasitically living off of farmers. That was a
Yeah.
Jeffersonian view. So anything like finance or manufacturing or commerce or trade or anything like in a city where you're not growing your own food, the Jeffersonians had this bias that all those people were frauds and parasites. Even John Adams thought that. And Hamilton said, this is just crazy. All these sectors are productive in their own way. They all contribute. They all are mutually self-supporting. He said, I'm not against agriculture, but I'm for these other sectors as well. And we have an imbalanced economy because we've been a colony of Britain. Britain doesn't want us to manufacture. Britain doesn't want us to have banks. Britain wants us to remain this kind of feudal, backward nation that just sends them raw materials. And his fight against that, obviously faced animosity from the Jeffersonians. So there's another good contribution on his part. It wasn't just the constitutional restrictions. It was very good on human rights and opposed to slavery, but call it his political economy, his view of, what a proper politics is in the economy. He was definitely the most pro-capitalist in that regard of all the founders, even though the word capitalism itself wasn't even coined until 1850. There's like everything about his policies have that element of what you'd want in a pro-capitalist policy, no bias against particular sectors, that kind of thing. So
I don't know if, I think there was one thing that maybe what we're kind of seeing though is I think Jefferson realized that if people were removed from the production of, say, their food, they would lose sight that food has to be produced. Like we had this attitude, well, we don't need farmers. We can just buy our food at the grocery store. It's like, I think that's where, and then, maybe there was this, and we have this large class now, of people who, as I say, really just go to meetings and push papers. It's.
Yeah, right. So there are people who do that. So and that bias is extended toward, any white collar worker, anyone like who's not sweating and, living by the sweat of their brow, that kind of thing. It's really interesting because Jefferson is saying these kind of things, and the Jeffersonians, right around the time that Adam Smith, a famous Scottish economist, is launching political economy. So 1776, the same year as our revolution, Smith writes The Wealth of Nations. And what's interesting about The Wealth of Nations is Smith criticizes physiocracy. He criticizes the French. Yeah, he criticizes the French and mercantilism, which is protectionism. And what's interesting is, since it's all happening at the same time, it's not like Jefferson is reading The Wealth of Nations and having his physiocracy refuted. But it is interesting because Smith basically takes it a step further and says, listen, manufacturing is productive too. It's not just farming, right? But here's Smith's mistake. Smith says within manufacturing, it's basically the physical labor that adds value.
Yes.
So he had that labor theory of value. So he kind of made the same mistake as Jefferson by narrowing who it is that was considered productive and noble, and of course led the way for thinking, well, these managers who are running the pin factory, they must be parasites. They're not sweating, they're not getting dirt under their fingernails. And Hamilton's loving manufacturing, and he's loving finance too. He helped start the Bank of New York, and New York finance and New York trade and all that kind of thing was something he saw as productive. And so he was like way ahead of Jefferson and Smith at the time. I know this is not a thing of hindsight. He's in the middle of it all. He says, wait a minute, that's productive and this is productive. And that's so notice that kind of argument gets you away from class warfare of thinking one class is is exploiting the other class. Hamilton's like, no, it is possible the government can exploit all classes, but it's not true that the farmer is being exploited by the manufacturer, or that the banker is, exploiting the merchant, that kind of thing.
That makes me wonder, how many of the founding fathers read Adam Smith?
Some of them. Hamilton definitely did, because you could tell it. It's been easily traced. There are whole passages of the Manufacturing Report, which was written in 1790, where Hamilton is citing our Smith arguments. So that's only 14 years later. But among the founders, among the five I just mentioned, Hamilton's really the only one that digs deep into the economic literature of the time. because he's Treasury. I mean, after helping Washington win the war, he's a Treasury Secretary. So he's like boning up on finance and money and banking and trade. And so he gathered a dozen or so books. This is easily traced, including The Wealth of Nations. And he's just devouring them and scouring them for advice. And that's one of the reasons he was against physiocracy. He could see that in Smith, but he was definitely against Smith's view that only the physical manual laborer was adding value. And Smith was pretty decent on finance, on banking. Smith knew that banking did contribute to the productivity of the economy, so he was okay there. But you can't say that about Washington. He didn't read much economics. Jefferson is known to have read a couple of French economists, but they tended to be physiocrats. De Tracy is one of them. Destutt de Tracy.
De Tracy.
He also did read. The one good thing about Jefferson, he did read my favorite economist at the time, and I don't think Hamilton did, mostly because it was a year before Hamilton died. But my favorite economist at the time was Jean-Baptiste Say, known for Say's Law. So Say is 1803, his major book. Well, that's like a year later. Hamilton's dead, so Hamilton's not going to be able to incorporate J.B. Say in his policies in the 1790s. But Jefferson becomes president, of course, the first 8 years of the 1800s. And he had read Jean-Baptiste Say, thought it was very good. But Jean-Baptiste Say himself criticized physiocracy and criticized the labor theory of value. So if he influenced Jefferson at all, it was in the right direction of realizing. And Jefferson did come around a little bit after Hamilton died and said, you know what, I have to admit manufacturing does add value. And maybe I'll admit that finance and commerce add value as well. So it took a long time for Jefferson to come around to the Hamiltonian view, is what it really amounts to.
Well, I think also, the founding fathers saw some of these corruption things that happen, I mean, how much do you think our founding fathers, I know one thing that really caused a lot of paranoia about banks was the South Sea bubble.
Yeah.
Which happened, I think, in the early 1600s, but that was
right, and a paper money scheme really from John Law, and tied up with France. Yeah, no, of course there had been financial scandals and things like that. The question was really, is this something unique and central to banking per se? That would be more the Jeffersonian view. I think it was Adams at one point, John Adams, who said, from Massachusetts. So this is a little weird because the Northeasterners, he was a Federalist, but the Northeasterners, Boston, New York, Philly, tended to be more favorable toward commerce, trade, and finance. But John Adams said at one point, all banking is a fraud. Every bank is a fraud. He didn't think, it's kind of like a Murray Rothbard view today. You could call them banksters, a really nasty kind of bias against banking. But on this score, it's probably worth mentioning at this point, the other controversy about Hamilton is, as Treasury Secretary, the dollar was in hyperinflation. It was worthless. It was called the Continental.
Yes.
It was issued by the Continental Congress, and it was worthless because instead of paying for the war by taxation, it tried to borrow, and then when it couldn't borrow anymore, it just printed money. Well, Hamilton and Washington, who were in the war at Valley Forge and seeing the worthlessness of the money, they would go to the Continental Congress looking for funding for the war, and the Congress wouldn't raise any taxes. So then the Congress would print money, and then they couldn't use it. Hamilton and Washington couldn't use the money to buy material, and they were complaining. And basically the Jeffersonians were like, we're not going to tax. So they declare independence, but they don't establish, the Jeffersonians, they declare independence, but then they kind of walk away and say, like, you guys figure it out. You guys figure out how to beat the British Empire, with military. And Jefferson contributed nothing to it. No military advice, no financing. And if anything, they were saying, hey, we just revolted over taxes. Why should we tax ourselves to fight the war with Britain? And Hamilton and Washington said, how else do you think we're going to pay for this? What are we going to do? Just steal things from farmers as we go? And that's what they ended up doing. It was awful. And Hamilton was against that. And as the war wound down, he would write letters to Washington saying, when this is over, we have got to stop this. We got to put an end to this really immoral and vicious, printing of money and borrowing money without limit. Those were not policies of Hamilton. Those were policies of the Jeffersonians, during the war that the Hamiltonians put an end to. So he was great as Treasury Secretary without getting into the gory details. The first thing he did was fix the dollar and put it on the gold standard right away. That was like one of the first things he did, wrote a big report on it, showed how to do it, and immediately put an end to the inflation and anchored the dollar. It was in silver and gold, so convertible. The second thing he did was he fixed the debt. The debt was like out of control. It had all been borrowed during the war. He didn't advocate the debt, he inherited it. But it was mostly in default and nobody would lend us any more money. So he fixed the debt in the sense of he made it payable again. He raised enough money to make it payable again. He converted it into, you know, debt that can be serviced. And the last thing he did, most controversially, Chris, you know, he's always accused of being the forerunner of the Federal Reserve, of the central bank. He promoted the idea of a nationwide bank called the Bank of the United States. It was chartered in 1790. There was a big dispute over it. The Jeffersonians were opposed to it. They portrayed it as a government bank, but it was actually privately owned. And the reason Hamilton and Washington and others wanted to do it is, one, they knew it could help fix the currency and fix the debt. But the other thing was it had offices in all 13 colonies, or I should say states at this point. And meanwhile, the states were very restrictive and wouldn't allow their banks to branch beyond their own states. So this was Hamilton and Washington and the Federalists basically saying, listen, if we're going to be the United States of America, we should be able to have a currency and a banking system which is interstate, you know, which goes across all 13 states from the tip of Maine down to whatever we had at the time, Georgia. And they did pass it, thankfully. It did totally unify the currency and make it more reliable and rational. And the other thing about it was not only privately owned, it was not a government bank. It was not a central bank. It was not issuing fiat paper money. It was not monetizing government debt, all the crappy things you see central banks doing today. And the other thing is it had a sunset provision. It was over in 20 years. You don't have that with the Fed. When the Fed was founded in 1913, you know, it did not have a 20-year sunset provision, but the first Bank of the United States ended on like clockwork in 1811. So it did have that 20-year charter. So it's unfair also to paint Hamilton as a kind of proto central banker. Even the Federal Reserve, if you go to its website, will say the Bank of the United States under Hamilton was a precursor to the Fed. That's a complete nonsense. Often what you'll see today is statists like that, like Fed officials or people who want government intervention in the economy. They'll always look for a founder because the founders have so much respect, you know, among Americans. They'll search high and low for a founder like that's on their side. So sadly, one of the things I have found over the years is that Hamilton is recruited in a way by these statists who want to claim, well, at least we have one of the founders. And it's done him a great disservice because they're using him and abusing him in ways that he never would have agreed to. So whether it's central banking, whether it's debt and deficit finance, none of which he advocated, whether it's protectionist tariffs, they'll cite Hamilton who said it's okay, or industrial policy, you know, financing some industries versus other. They take little pieces of what Hamilton did, none of which adds up to what they're trying to do. And they just, you know, they do it because they want at least one of the founders to be on their side, as they say.
One of the criticisms, you know, is that, you know, and I've asked this question too, you know, is if the Federalists wanted the power to charter a bank, why didn't they put that power explicitly in the Constitution instead of, you know, initiating this necessary and proper crap, which I think opens up a huge can of worms. You know, we can do everything that's necessary and proper to execute our, you know, the things we're allowed, that the Constitution allows us to do.
Yeah, and the Constitution does have a provision against, I'm trying to remember the phrase, something like it forbids emitting bills of, I forget what it's called, like paper money. It doesn't say paper money, but bills of something, I forget what it's called. But it's a specific rejection of the idea of issuing inconvertible fiat paper money. That is in the Constitution. And then, of course, also in the Constitution says the money shall be coined as precious metals. So going off the gold standard was unconstitutional. Setting up the Federal Reserve, I think, itself was unconstitutional as well. And the Jeffersonians, the hypocrites as they tended to be, they reinstituted another Bank of the United States 4 years after the first one expired. So in 1814 or so. Because guess why? Because they're looking at the War of 1812, and once again they don't want to tax people. So they print money and use this. So the second Bank of the United States, the second one was really the politicized, cronyist, paper money issuing Bank of the United States, which people remember, and they think it had anything to do with Hamilton. That nothing to do with Hamilton. Hamilton was dead by now. It was the Jeffersonian Democrat version of the bank. Thankfully, Jackson put an end to that in 1836. Andrew Jackson, who was to his credit, he was a Democrat. He put an end to it because he knew it was corrupt. It was Biddle's Bank, they called it, the guy from Philadelphia. So for 1836, for 80 years, the U.S. had no central bank. I think actually people sometimes ask what the period Hamilton most would have loved. I think Hamilton most would have loved 1865 to 1915. So right after the Civil War and right before World War I, you have this wonderful 50-year period where I think we were the most capitalist ever, because now you could say the labor market was not slavery, right? We got rid of slavery. It's really hard to describe the decades up to the Civil War as a free. It wasn't really a free economy when you have slavery. You can't have that. Yeah. But it was the Republicans, the ones, the Lincoln Republicans were basically the successors to the Hamiltonian Federalists. So I see a long line in American history running from Washington, Hamilton, Lincoln, Coolidge, Reagan. They're all either Federalists or Republicans. Then the other lineage is Jefferson, Jackson, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, and whatever bozo we have in the White House now.
You might want to put Henry Clay in between Hamilton and Lincoln. You
could put Clay. You could put many others in there. But if you think of those five on each side that I named, I mean, I think the ones who most contributed to the greatness of America, Washington, Hamilton, Lincoln. Lincoln kept us together, at least got rid of slavery. You could say Grant maybe afterwards, but Coolidge, the Roaring Twenties was Coolidge and Mellon. Mellon was a Treasury Secretary in the Hamiltonian flavor. And then Reagan. I mean, at various points, they were all so critical to making sure America at least stayed as much American as possible. But the others, I hate to say it, to some objectivists and libertarians will not like to hear this, that the Jeffersonian, Jackson, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, LBJ side of it has been awful. It gave us the New Deal. It gave us the Great Society crap. It gave us a bunch of wars. It's so night and day to me that I have a hard time believing that objectivists and libertarians lean Jeffersonian, but they tend to.
At the same time, I have a hard time believing that Jefferson and Jackson would be in favor of anything we have today. And
that's possible. Yeah.
And I don't know. Dr. Lawrence Reed of the Foundation for Economic Education. He often says that Cleveland was his favorite president. And I think going from Cleveland to William Jennings Bryan, I think was huge. That was really because Cleveland was really the last of the constitutional presidents on the blue side.
Yes, true. Yeah, he was probably one of the better Democrat presidents. Yeah, and of course I omitted from the Republican side Teddy Roosevelt, who I thought was awful. But Teddy Roosevelt in the whole quote unquote progressive era, he started the trust busting. And he started the conservation movement of buying vast amounts of land, basically nationalizing vast amounts of land. I think he was awful, just awful. But he was a favorite of John McCain right up until John McCain's death. John McCain thought the Teddy Roosevelt version of the Republican Party was the best. But I think, Chris, today, another way of looking at today, the reason I titled my piece a couple of years ago, America at Her Best, is Hamiltonian, as America does have some checkered history, obviously, with slavery and other things. But what I'm saying is, if we can get to the essence of what is the Hamiltonian approach versus the Jeffersonian approach, I'm not even of the view that we need a little of each, because that's a very common view too. Once people start realizing Hamilton's so good, they'll say, well, why are you being so anti-Jefferson? Why? One of the reasons I think is the anti-business, racial, to the extent America has still racism in it, it is a leftover of that feudalistic Southern Jeffersonian view. And I just hate to say it, but that's in there. And there isn't a bit of racism in people like Hamilton and others. And so there is this lineage you can look to and be proud of. And I think it's a real shame that America today can't look back and say, because it sounds partisan to them, the Republican side of things has been pretty good. If Lincoln is a hero, he's a Republican hero. And but if you ask the average college student today, they think the Democrats put an end to slavery, not that they spread slavery, that the Democrats, Jim Crow and all that stuff, it's all Democrat, the KKK, the lynchings. I mean, it's all, look at Mark Levin's book about the Democratic Party. It's a very sordid history of America at her worst. And yet we still have this party today. I'm not saying the party should be dissolved. I'm saying the party should admit to this horrendous track record and stop bad-mouthing Republicans as for all the things they badmouth them with. But and the Republicans themselves, I don't think know their own history. They should be very proud of the history and realize that it goes back to Washington and Hamilton, continues through Lincoln, Coolidge. They know nothing about the Roaring '20s and why it was a Republican decade that got us up and running again after World War I. The other thing the Republicans are very good at, and again, Hamilton and Washington suggested that this would be true, they tend not to get us in wars. If you look at, Chris, forget the Revolutionary War, Chris, if you just start with War of 1812, War with Mexico in 1848, the Civil War, clearly due to the Democrats seceding, World War I, Wilson got us into that, World War II, FDR gets us into that, the Korean War, Truman gets us into, these are all Democrats. The Vietnam War, JFK and LBJ get us into. It's incredible. Now, Reagan wins the Cold War. The Republicans won the Cold War, not the Democrats. The record on the two parties, just in regard to war, is so different. That's not well known either.
Well, I would add the Spanish-American War, though. But
which was
But Richard, this is one thing that always, as somebody who's a capitalist, always bothers me. Is there's this attitude that it wasn't there seems to be this attitude on both sides, is that especially promoted by Americans, that, well, the Cold War was won because we spent all this money in the military. And why don't you just acknowledge that the Cold War was won because they had a system that was unsustainable?
Oh, right.
I mean, why don't you acknowledge that? I mean, to me, that's almost an admission that socialism was working. I mean, acknowledge that communism failed because it had to fail. Because none of us thought we'd be fighting socialists 35 years later after the Berlin Wall fell down.
Yeah, and remember the policy, even Nixon adopted this, but the policy had been coexistence, like peaceful coexistence in there. Détente, right, in the late 70s, détente. So there was this idea, because they were so sympathetic, the left and most of the Democrats, they were so sympathetic to socialism, it was almost like they were hoping that the Soviet experiment would work. And even if they weren't hoping, they were at least believing this thing will, like what Khrushchev said, these people will bury us, they will outperform us. Keynes was known for this. Keynes was painted as a savior of capitalism, but all during the 20s, Keynes was praising the Soviet Union. This is a wonderful experiment. This is great. They're crushing the money motive. They're crushing individualism. And this is Keynes, and he's still popular today in the economics departments. Yeah, I agree. It's also interesting that when Reagan came in 1980, he had this foreign policy advisor, Dick Allen, and Dick Allen tells a story where he sits down with Reagan, and they're laying out, what the policy position should be in the run against Carter. And Dick Allen says to Reagan, so what's your theory of the Cold War? And Reagan says, we win and they lose. So when Reagan got in and he started referring to them as an evil empire, and they're going to end up on the ash heap of history, he said that at the British Parliament in 1982. He definitely took this more not so much aggressive, but principled moral argument that you guys are losers, both morally and economically. And I think it really undermined the confidence of the Soviets as to what they could do or not do. And I think you could say that Gorbachev helped, that Gorbachev and Reagan and Thatcher, the three of them really made it possible to peacefully end that monstrosity. But it was still because Gorbachev realized at this point, we are not going to outproduce them. We are falling apart here. And but still, that was a Republican accomplishment. That was not the stance of the Democrats. The Democrats were always peaceful coexistence. If anything, they risked a nuclear war in 1962 with Kennedy being so weak against Khrushchev. So they paint the 62 October missile crisis. They paint JFK there as a hero, but actually he got us closest to nuclear war. It's a typical Democrat thing. They pose as friends of liberty and democracy, but they often get us in wars, as Joe Biden is doing now.
Yeah. Let's getting back to the what did Hamilton think about Jefferson? I think the worst mistake Jefferson ever made was advocating for socialistic schools. Where was Hamilton on that issue?
Agreed. Yeah, that Hamilton was not for government in schools. Adams was. Massachusetts had laws financing them very early on.
Yeah, Massachusetts goes back all the way to the Puritan legacy. I mean, they were really the first socialists, and that legacy never really went away.
I know. I think it's one of the great tragedies of American history that very early on, that side of it at least, the Republicans weren't completely clean on this, but the idea that the government should be involved at all in the financing or instruction of education has been awful. And the one way I put it, Chris, is, look how long it took us to realize, you mentioned socialism, to realize that public ownership and control of the means of production is disastrous. Well, the way I put it is, what about public ownership and control of the means of instruction, of schooling?
Yes.
That, just as the first one destroys capital, machinery and financial capital and prosperity, the second one does destroy human capital and human potential. I mean, it kills these kids. And it's not necessary. I guess I've heard it argued that just because the government is financing running the schools doesn't mean the philosophy of education has to be terrible. But we all know that if you don't have competition and you can forcibly take money from people and finance an enterprise like schooling, and then if you have things like truancy laws where you arrest people if they don't go to your schools, I mean, this is just unbelievable. No other product or service in the country can be run this way without, it being a scandal. And yet people, even from the conservative side, they very rarely question public schooling. So the opportunity to have bad pedagogy, to have, the look-say method replace phonics so there's mass illiteracy. I mean, could that happen in private schooling system? It could. But in a public schooling system, it's institutionalized. You get one wrong policy and it's adopted coast to coast. And so anyway, Jefferson was an advocate of partial public schooling, and a lot of the founders were, but Hamilton was not.
I do wonder. It's one area where as much as I have to admit, I'm more partial to the era from, at least in the North, from 1836 to the Civil War, because that was also a great time of prosperity in the northern states.
Yeah. Agreed.
But, because it seems like to me we started to move away from this capitalism, more to this corporate welfare model. I mean, and I think a big example was all that land they gave away to the railroads, starting during the Civil War and after that.
Yeah.
That seemed to be, which was really just a huge corporate welfare project.
Well, it's interesting because the method by which, and this starts with the Louisiana Purchase, which is Jefferson. But by the way, is one of the few things Jefferson did that Hamilton actually endorsed, and it happens just before Hamilton dies. So there was this controversy, but he almost doubles the size of the landmass of the U.S., if I recall, by the Louisiana Purchase. But And I think he paid Napoleon $15 million. So the Hamiltonians laughed because they said, "Hey, Jeffersonians, I thought you were against public debt. I thought you were against borrowing." But it's interesting because Jefferson's motives are so different from the Hamiltonians. You know what Jefferson's motive was? The Jeffersonians said, if we restrict ourselves to these 13, now 14, 15 states, we're going to become too manufacturing oriented. We're going to become too densely packed in. We're going to become urban. We're going to become corrupt. The only way to retain and extend rural America, agrarian America, is to double its size and buy this whole empty landmass. I mean, that is twisted when you think about it. It isn't this idea of, hey, let's create what will become this great United States of America. It was the typical Jeffersonian fear that we were going to become too capitalistic, too manufacturing oriented. Now, the Hamiltonians said, no, this is good because we're going to be a great nation. And let's not have France any part of near us. Let's not have Spain owning Florida. Let's get the European powers out of here. And so that was their motive. And their motive was so we can develop the thing. We can develop the place. And it did bring up the issue, Chris, of, well, how do you privatize it? Because when you think about it, the U.S. government bought the Louisiana Purchase.
Yes.
And the next step was they could have kept it as national lands.
Yeah.
And we would have been like a semi-socialist country because they own the means of production. Part of it is land. And the Homestead Act and others, I think the Homestead Act was, I forget, pre-civil. There was an attempt to privatize. Yeah, they had 40 acres and a mule, all that kind of thing. They attempted to privatize. It didn't always work well, though, because as you say, when they wanted to promote railroad extension, there would often be corruption involved in who got the land and who got the land right.
Yeah, and that's an issue too, because like just like the federal government owns all of Alaska, who wants it?
Yeah.
You have all this land. I mean, they say privatize the land. Who's going to buy it? Who's going to buy land? All this land in Alaska. It's like, it's the same. And Russia has the same thing. They have all this land that nobody wants, and Canada. Because it's so cold up there. It's
yeah.
Yeah,
the other thing is, if you pull up, it's very interesting. If you pull up a map of the U.S., but ask for a map, go to Google Images can give you this, and just put in map of like publicly owned lands versus not. Yeah. And if you look, you see most of the West. No, I would say most of the West. A lot of the West, the Rockies and elsewhere, is owned by the U.S. government, and then a big part of Alaska. Well, if you and so way on the right of the right-hand side of the country, of course, it was settled first when we had private property respecting regimes. And so most of that is private property. And I don't think it's just because there's these vast lands in the West that are, say, difficult to cultivate. I don't think that's the main reason you show the map of the government owning most of the land in the West. The country was changing as well to become more interventionist. And the whole Teddy Roosevelt thing, I mean, when you think about it, Teddy Roosevelt, we're talking late 1800s, early 1900s, right? The whole conservation movement and John Muir and all that. And so the country, just in that one picture, you get this sense of a country that for its first 100 years was private oriented and capitalist oriented, and has these great cities. And in the second half of the hundreds, it's no, the government's going to own all this stuff, and we're going to stop development, and we're going to preserve, and we're going to quarantine. And there it is right on the map itself, a difference of two types of countries, one more capitalist in the beginning and one less so in the last 100 years or so. And actually, since Clinton, and maybe even more since Clinton, every year the government buys more and more property and adds it to its portfolio. So if anything, there's a gradual increase in those holdings. Alaska came in 1959. I mean, so that alone tells you, Hawaii and Alaska, I think 1959. The fact that Alaska is mostly government owned isn't just that there's vast tracts of seemingly untapped. It's that's the philosophy today, that it shouldn't be privately owned, which is a shame.
Richard, where else do you think America went wrong, and how do you think we can possibly get it back? Or have we reached a point where we really can't get it back without it just completely collapsing and trying to rebuild something on the top of that. I
Well,
mean, can the building be repaired, or do we have to tear down the building and rebuild a new one?
Oh no, I think it can definitely be repaired. I don't think either a tearing down if you're talking about revolutionary and or promoting collapse or waiting for collapse is necessary. I say that because there have been 3 or 4 episodes in America where things looked very grim and then things got very good. So one obvious one is Civil War. I mean, that is the most obvious case of holy shit, we're probably not even going to survive this. And yet, as I said, those 50 years afterwards were wonderful. The whole Industrial Revolution and all that is another one I would name after World War One. After World War One, we have like hyperinflation, we have shortages, millions of guys have died, and the 1920s, the Roaring 20s were great. The other one I would name, I guess, is when Reagan, Thatcher, and others came in. So the 70s were pretty bad. You and I remember that, the gas lines, the hyperinflation, the Soviets are marching all over the place. The revival of the last 20 years, 1980 to 2000, that was an amazing 2-decade run where America was revived. So I think of things like that and think, well, not only that, but we know a lot more now than we did, during the Civil War time, during World War One, during the Reagan years. We have this shelf of great literature and great books, Ayn Rand, Ludwig von Mises, Hayek and others, Hazlitt. We didn't have that in World War One, so it's not like the knowledge isn't there and isn't growing. But I agree with you, it's definitely a minority view. And if I were to say the 2 things that most went wrong in America, one was the whole populist progressive era of the 1890s and up to World War One. Very sad because it was anti-capitalist and it was anti-big business. They called all the achievers robber barons. They smeared their name. That episode was terrible, and we still have lingering aspects of that today. Hillary Clinton and others still call themselves progressives. I think it's incumbent upon advocates of capitalism and objectivism and even libertarians to stop calling these other people liberal. They're not liberals, they're illiberal. And don't call them progressives because they're anti-progress. I mean, these people are against nuclear power. They're against any kind of technological advance. They're really very barbaric in their attitudes. And I think in some regards, misanthropic. In other words, they're not just misguided. They're actually misanthropes. They know that capitalism is the best habitat for humanity. They know that it produces the wealth and the prosperity, and they hate it anyway. That is very nasty. That is a very nasty kind of attitude. I say to people, it's not 1917. And they say, what do you mean by that? I say, in 1917, you might have thought that socialism will lead to good results. Okay, maybe I would give you the naivete of thinking that. But it's 2024 now, and you're still saying it? After 25 experiments and 100 million people dead? And you know what I'm saying, Chris? At some point, you can't feign ignorance anymore. At some point, you have to say, you know damn well what that will do, and you want it anyway. Okay, we should be able to win that argument. I think we should.
There's no excuse anymore. It's
yeah.
And the people who truly were honest saw through it immediately.
One technique you can use, which I found very effective, and sometimes conservatives will make this mistake. Rush Limbaugh for years used to say, hey, folks, liberalism doesn't work. Or they'll say, no, socialism doesn't work. You know what I say? Stop complimenting them. Because why is that a compliment? When you say liberalism doesn't work, your premise is, and the socialist, your premise is something like, they really do want peace and prosperity, but for some reason, their systems don't work. And what I'm saying, Chris, is no, they do not want peace and prosperity. They know that if they implement their systems, they will get poverty and war. And at some point, you just have to say they must want that. It's hard to question people's motives, but when the track record is so obvious, the way to put it is, no, their systems work beautifully. They impoverish people and get us in wars all the time. And at some point, you have to say, you people are not being humane. These are not humanitarian policies. They're not progressive, and they're not liberal in the sense of being pro-liberty.
Well, and now they're just promoting all other kinds of nonsense that is just it's all really part of their anti-capitalism. But it's I don't know where, and this is a
some of it when it gets to questioning whether a man is a woman and and who can have babies or not, you could argue that is such a dead end, Chris, that it gets to such a bizarre level that it's a sign of bankruptcy. It's not a sign that they're winning. Yeah. It's a sign that they're so badly losing that they're backed into the corner of, if it begins with any kind of political system is allowed, we'll still have prosperity. And all the way down to any kind of, sexual makeup is allowed. They're questioning now even the metaphysical realities, not just the political realities. It's a total dead end. And so they're not winning because they're very convincing. Or that they're sane. They're winning because our side really isn't strong enough and confident enough, I think, yet. And by our side, I mean any kind of right-leaning. I talk to conservatives and libertarians and objectivists all the time. I consider those the three type of right-leaning groups, and they differ on fundamentals, as you know. But most of them love their country and love America, and they're not going to smear it. And that is a formidable, those three are a formidable group. I think of the three of them, I obviously believe that the objectivists are the most consistent philosophically, and they can do a lot of good bolstering libertarians and conservatives. So, and I think over the years, conservatives and libertarians have trashed objectivists less. They used to trash us a lot for being, secular, or for being too purely capitalist, or in the case of the libertarian anarchists, they oppose us even for having any kind of limited government. But I think the objectivist argument within the right is the kind of fueled, catalyst, confident, vigorous part of it. It's a minority view on the right, but it's the one that I think that gives the right the most vigor and the most confidence to be combative and fight for capitalism.
I think a lot of anarcho-capitalists just ask the question, can you keep a government from becoming malignant? And really,
right.
This is something that's never been done. It's permanent.
It's interesting that I think I pushed back a little there, and it's one of my themes on Hamilton. I think I have said on this issue that I believe one of the reasons, because I see them doing it, one of the reasons I believe ANCAPs most hate Hamilton is that he and Washington and the founders did show that you can create a limited government. And the Brits actually showed that. The Brits showed it beforehand, with the Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Again, not perfect, but the idea that there are these two great examples in world history, the Brits and the Americans, that however briefly it happened, you can say they did constitutionally limit government. Wow, that's amazing. Now it didn't
for
stick.
A while, yeah,
it didn't stick. But I don't think the reason it failed to stick was because they had. They missed certain features of Article 6, Section 1. You see that all the time. Well, there was this inconsistency. It's that there was not philosophic support afterwards. After they left the scene. And so I think it is demonstrable that you can have constitutionally limited government. I think it has been demonstrated, but you really do have to know the underlying pillars, the arguments that go into that. And that's what's been lost, really, not the track record of whether it can actually be done or not.
Well, that's another thing. We've lost. That's a problem. Has been the treason of the intellectuals, so to speak. I mean, it's really kind of amazing. And we talk about checks and balances, but before Amy Coney Barrett was put on the Supreme Court, all 9 on the Supreme Court were either from Harvard or Yale Law School. Now I'm not saying we should put this into the Constitution. But maybe it would be a good idea if all 9 on the Supreme Court came from 9 different law schools. You talk about diversity. Well, there's a place where let's get law school diversity.
Right. Or if it was the case that, say, Yale and Harvard were the most prestigious, but they were also diversified, in outlook, then I wouldn't mind if they were all from Yale and Harvard, because there'd still be diversity. The problem is Yale and Harvard themselves are undiversified.
Yeah. There's
So
That's
on
the
top
weird
of that,
thing. You have these allegedly open institutions, and yet there's almost no diversity there. I mean, with the exception of some tokens like Hillsdale and Hillsdale and Grove City. I mean, and my goodness, Richard, you're a Duke for God's sakes.
right?
I mean, Nancy McLean, the lacrosse false accusations. I mean, Duke's as bad as any place.
Well, I can also say it's better than most because
Yeah.
it does care more about diversity of view, and it's known
Okay,
for,
well, that's good to
for
hear.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't be here if that weren't the case. So there's much more diversity, and I don't know. I think it was Leonard Peikoff many years ago said something very profound. He said something like, he said, "I know the faculty of most universities is imbalanced. 99, 100% against capitalists." He said, "I'm not even asking for, 1/3, 50-50 or 1/3. Or he said, if there were just like 2 out of 100 that were, pro-constitution, pro-capitalism, everything, it would make a big difference." And actually, there's some truth to that because the students can tell. If the students just get a different view, but you're still in the minority, so it's still like 2 against 98. To the extent the 98 all sound familiar, similar, you can kind of lump them together as, oh yeah, all those 98 who keep saying the same thing over and over again. So in a way, it does come down to 2 versus 2. See what I mean? Even though it's 2 out of 100, the students are most of them are astute about, wow, that's a different viewpoint. I haven't heard that before. It is incumbent, though, on people who go into academia who are a minority view intellectually. I can definitely attest to this. You have to be smarter. You have to do more research. You have to be more scholarly. You have to be more gentlemanly, if you will, the gentleman and the scholar. You have to be more polite. I mean, I tend to be that way anyway, although I can be combative in argument. But this idea of, they're all your enemy and suspect them, I don't agree with that. It is true that there's imbalance, but there's imbalance in many professions. Like if you go into Hollywood, you're going to face this, right? If you're a pro-liberty, everyone knows that, a Hollywood person or Broadway, that kind of thing. So the key, though, is to stick to your principles. Don't hide your light under a bushel. Don't pretend you're otherwise. Don't be canceled if you can avoid it. Don't let people, browbeat you into silence. And you'd be surprised how many people will say, okay, I'm not going to attack that person. They're strong. And then you become like a guide to others, and others see how it's done and how it can be done without, being crazy and saying stupid things. So that's advice I would give to people who are in the minority, but want to get into these professions, either academia or the arts, or even in business, is becoming a minority view. It'd like to be a CEO who says, hey, I'm just going to serve my shareholders and maximize profits. That is now considered apostasy.
That's the worst thing, is I think, almost there's so few advocates for capitalism among the billionaire class. I mean, even,
Yeah.
even, and what gets me, and to me, one of the worst is Mark Cuban, because he claims to be an Ayn Rand fan. It's like, well, when has he ever advocated for Ayn Rand?
Yeah, here's another way of thinking about it. On the positive side, have you noticed in the last year or so, maybe, well, actually since October 7th, since the attack on Israel, alums who are standing up saying, why am I giving to my university if it's anti-Semitic? Why am I giving to my university if it's so undiversified? And these are, usually wealthy hedge fund guys, Bill Ackman, Leon Cooperman, and others. And I say to myself, well, it's long time past that alumni pay attention to what they're funding, because they typically fund their alma maters kind of out of nostalgia.
Yeah.
They're the good old days. They remember, they get the alumni office knocking on the door. They feel grateful that they've succeeded in America and everything. But they're succeeding. Cuba's an example. They're succeeding financially and capitalistically, and then funding these universities which are anti-capitalist. So, and if you say anything, the universities will say, don't interfere with our academic freedom. Don't tell us what to say or teach. Now, I'm all for academic freedom, but these guys and women, these wealthy people, should have the freedom to say, I'm not sending money to you anymore. You're hostile to me. What I'm waiting for, Chris, actually, is not just defunding alma maters who are nasty, toward capitalism, and not just say suspending payments for a couple of quarters, as some of them are doing. They should just start their own universities. I mean, if you look at the great ones like Stanford, Vanderbilt, Carnegie Mellon, even Duke, they were all financed by business people.
Yes, they all have a name on Purdue. Yeah.
Right. So they put the name on the building.
Most ones that have a name on it. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I jotted down the other day, I was thinking, how many are like that? And I wrote down 50 names at least before I came to an end, saying, wow, look at all these. And so today the argument should not be, hey, how big a check shall I write to Harvard? The question should be, why don't you start your own? Why isn't there a Musk University?
Yeah.
Why isn't there should be an Ackman University? These guys they're multimillionaires. It takes maybe 10 or 15 million to start a university. And when you look at Carnegie Mellon, all the others, if you look at the history, they all started with, the first class was 500 people. Okay. Yeah. So do it that way. It wouldn't take long.
It's interesting too. I on another call, I didn't realize how much Howard Hughes was involved with Grove City, but he was. And, also something like the Teal Fellowship, that's
right. Yeah.
Not another.
Well, there's good like experiments and projects going on like that.
I could see Musk. I could see Musk or Teal getting into something like that.
Yeah.
Because being from South Africa, I think Musk understands just how this woke nonsense completely and totally destroys a country and literally takes it from being, going from, living in the 1980s to going back to living in the 1700s, which is what's basically happened in Africa.
Yeah. Well, this is what I would call the strategy of the workaround.
Yeah.
Where it's equivalent to actually, if a heart is so far gone that you can't get a heart transplant, but you get a bypass. You get bypass surgery. So what is bypass surgery? You still have the heart, but they bring in other veins and you work around and you bypass. So the idea would be bypass. If the universities that you find are too far gone, then bypass them. Send your money elsewhere. Set up your own university if you must. And I would say the same thing on public schools. Remember the controversy during COVID, during the lockdowns, the parents would learn, oh my God, what is my kid being taught here over Zoom? And they would go to school boards and protest. Well, if you think about it, a school board is like, like commissars are sitting up there on high telling you how they're going to educate their kids. And you can scream and yell and bang the podium and try to get the school board to behave. But one approach is just get your kid out of the school entirely and set up your own either homeschooling or some other thing. And that has happened. I was talking to an entrepreneurial an education entrepreneur the other day who consults and helps people put these programs together. And she said, she's from FI, Carrie McDonald, and she said it's a vast movement. She thinks there's at least 30 million kids now in schools, in private schools or charter schools or homeschooling or other kind of academies like Thales Academy, which are outside of the public school system. That's the best way to do it. Just move them out. It's going to be hard to convert the public school system to a better system. It's in the same way that Harvard might be too far gone to have some alum have them hire like one pro-capitalist professor. I mean, it's almost futile to even do that. Why not go start your own university and fill it up with real scholars and let them make fun of you, that it's called Musk University but how did we get Carnegie Mellon? How did we get Duke, Stanford, Vanderbilt? And we got it by wealthy businessmen putting their money into it and trying to hire scholars.
That's something I've been really scratching my head about was the libertarians and the somewhat conservatives, but just like, why are you complaining that they shut down the schools? Like, why? This is an opportunity. But Richard, that is one thing I wanted to ask you about too. What happened to our movement 4 years ago? I couldn't believe the number of people who thought, and that seems to be why you broke from ARI.
It is.
Why did our movement why did so many people who allegedly believe in freedom sell out on this nonsense?
Yeah. It's hard to explain, but it is one of the reasons why I was very critical in spring of 2020, and the crackdowns were just beginning then. So it's not like I did it in hindsight. I could detect at the time that this was a very bad approach to lockdown, the social distancing, and Trump and Fauci and all that were kind of part of it. But if you talk about our side, objectivists who had no problem with mandated vaccines or had no problem with lockdowns and things like that, or even had no problem like taking PPP money. I mean, the Ayn Rand Institute took bailouts from Trump. It's just disgusting.
Yeah.
I was at the Atlas. I joined the Atlas Society. They didn't take a dime. On principle, they didn't take a dime. They were offered money, but you don't simultaneously accuse Trump of being Mussolini, which is what ARI did, and then take money from him. They did both. They accused him of Mussolini, which he isn't. I mean, he's no Alexander Hamilton, but he's certainly not Mussolini, Donald Trump.
And there were a lot of
how they portrayed him as a would-be dictator. Then they took the bailout money. So I coined the phrase Faucism, not fascism, but Faucism for Anthony Fauci. The idea of the government intervening massively in the economy based on public health phobias. I fear that could be the new thing that happens, because it's one thing to get like a financial crisis every 7 or 8 years, where the government, massively causes it and then invades even worse. But viruses come around a lot. We get a flu every season. We can get nefarious people like China. They're sending us stuff. So I fear that if this model is repeated, we're going to be down the fascist road much more quickly via the public health system. Where they scare you into thinking. I don't know whether we've learned the lesson from the COVID lockdowns, but apropos your point, Chris, yes, it's kind of inside baseball stuff. But you and I know that within the objectivist movement, some of us were much more pro-liberty and pro-rights, like me and the Atlas Society, and others were just terrible. Some libertarians were quiet as well. They might not have been endorsing it, but a lot of libertarians talked to each other and said, why were we silent about this? Why weren't we objecting?
Yeah,
I have many essays up at the American Institute for Economic Research, AIER.org, in the 2020 period, where right from the beginning I was criticizing it as awful and terrible and unwise.
Yeah, that's why I think probably the biggest hero during all of this was Jeff Tucker. But
agreed. And Jeff and I worked closely together that year. We were both working for AIER and involved in the Great Barrington Declaration.
Yeah, and the worst thing is some were just silent about it. They just didn't.
Yeah, they were.
Say a word. There were a few people I thought that. I think some started to come out, and I think some started to come out against it, but then they were quickly shouted down by.
Yeah.
Some of the more principled libertarians. They thought, okay, maybe I shouldn't. But yeah, and now we have some people who are like pretending that they never. They're just pretending that it never happened. I mean,
right.
Really, on the public level, Penn Jillette was a huge disappointment, and he definitely, and those guys he definitely will cite Ayn Rand as an influence. Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, part of it was they were painting the objectors as anti-vax or anti-science. I wrote a piece at the time called "Yes, Let's Follow the Science in Every Field." And the every field part was, okay, yes, in epidemiology, let's follow the science. I said, let's also follow the science in economics, which says don't shut down an economy. Let's also follow political science, which tells us that our rights should be preserved even in an emergency. You know what I mean? So I went through and philosophically and things like that. So it's not that you're anti-science, it's that the whole debacle was anti-science, from the epidemiology to Faucism to masking to distancing to it was like science was thrown out on every field, including economics. I wrote something at the time called "Unwealthy is Unhealthy." So unwealthy meaning shut down the economy and go hide and take a check from the government so that there's hyperinflation. That is unhealthy for people. So it wasn't a means for preserving or prioritizing health over wealth. But that was the argument, right? Stay home so you don't get other people sick. If I have a moment to plug a book I published called "Where Have All the Capitalists Gone?" So if you look up on Amazon, "Where Have All the Capitalists Gone?" it has many of my essays from 2020 on the COVID lockdowns. So they're like chapters reprinted from that year, but there's others from over the years. So people might get a kick out of that book. It's a very good book, I think.
And I also think that this is you're not following much, but this is also what likely fueled the Reno reset in the Libertarian Party in 2022, where a bunch of people just got thrown out, and it probably also helped Javier Milei.
Yeah,
which I still think that might be the most important election in the history of the world. And maybe that's an exaggeration, but
I think we'll know in retrospect. He's been off to a fairly decent start. I'm a big fan. If after a year of this, Chris, he really gets
yeah,
inflation, he gets inflation down. I think he's already balanced the budget.
yeah,
If he gets inflation down and fixes the currency, and radically reduces government spending, and then just a couple other things, because as you know, the first year is very difficult. First couple of years of Reagan, he was getting shit for all the leftover from Carter. If he can get through this, it might turn out to be, in retrospect, one of the most important elections, because people, not just in South America and elsewhere, they'll say, wow, it is possible to go close to a libertarian policy from a socialist one, because that's a big swing in one, in the spectrum, so to speak, and not easy to pull off. I think my view was he faces the same problem that Trump did, namely, if you're an outsider and you win because you're an outsider, in part, you have very few helpers in the sense of, you do need to fill your cabinet and your advisories that with, credentialed, experienced people. And the whole point is they don't have experienced, credentialed people on their side. And so the bureaucracy establishes itself, tries to undermine you. It's hard to do. And it's a kind of paradox, isn't it? If unless you're an outsider, you can't shake things up. But once you get inside, you have the establishment working against you. That certainly happened with Trump. I think Trump was, like, for example, trying to get out of Afghanistan, as he promised he would. And the Pentagon kept scaring the shit out of him, telling him, we can't do that, we can't do that. And he never left. He never got out of there. So those kind of things, you really have to be strong. But it's hard if you don't have helpers. When Reagan got in 1980, he had a bunch of helpers because he had been governor of California for 2 terms. So he had the think tanks, he had Heritage, Cato, other people, and could go in and have at least 1,000 resumes of people he could hire in the various agencies. Trump didn't have that, and Trump won't have that if he gets elected in November. I fear in the next 4 years, probably, because half of them are in jail.
It's I've heard Milei cite Murray Rothbard, and the person I've heard him cite twice is actually Israel Kirzner. So he's read a lot of economics, at least.
Yeah.
At least what's been translated into Spanish. And there's also, January they had their first monthly budget surplus in 12 years.
Yes, I saw that.
That's a positive step. I think it could be, maybe South America will be the place to be in the next 100 years. Who knows? I hope so, because I think it could definitely have an impact on the rest of South America.
Agreed. It turns out also that, if I recall right, he didn't even begin reading Mises and the Free Marketers until 2013. This is only 10 years old for him. I think he's in his 40s, right? If people want more on this, by the way,
he's about 50. He's about 52 or 53, I believe.
I did I think maybe a 90-minute webinar. If people are interested in this, me and Stephen Hicks, a philosophy professor from Illinois, Stephen and I did an entire 90 minutes on Malay for the Atlas Society. So if you go to atlassociety.org and look under events and videos, you'll see that. It's a club. It was a clubhouse, so it's audio, but lots of good stuff on Malay. And right after he got elected, and our prognostications of how he would do.
Oh yeah, he was born in 1970, so he's a little older. Well, okay. I think that's all we got to say for now. Where can we find you out there?
Well, the best way to go, Chris, is if you go to richardsalsman.com. So it's Richard and SALSMAN.com. If you go there, you'll connect to all the other sites I'm at, including Duke and AIER and the Atlas Society. But that's kind of like a hub to go to, and you'll get my stuff. Otherwise, you can go to Amazon, put my name in, and 4 or 5 books there you'll like. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Anything else you want to say before we go?
Be positive. Our arguments are formidable, and we have reality on our side. So there's reason to be optimistic, but it's going to take a lot of work.
We just have to have the courage. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel. Go buy my novel Escape from the Village. Check out my Substack. Also, just a few shows ago, I had a guy talk about Thomas Paine. So this will be a good counter to that. But I love to talk about history, but yeah. So anyway, thank you for coming on, Richard. I'm Chris Baker, and we're out.